I just had the best 10-day vacation of my life. Beaches, drinks, zero stress. Meanwhile, my HOA president neighbor spent those wasted same hours screaming at my garage door, calling cops, and hiring 3 different locksmiths, all because her car was trapped inside my garage. She had no idea I was watching every meltdown on my phone from 3,000 miles away. Best entertainment I've ever paid for. I didn't even need Netflix. Anyone else ever had someone steal their parking spot? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Bonus points if it was a power-tripping HOA. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a stolen parking spot. It's about ego, entitlement, and what happens when the wrong person thinks they run the neighborhood. Buckle up. Now let me tell you how this whole beautiful mess started. My name's Connor Walsh, and I work in computer repair from my home office. Nothing too fancy, just fixing laptops and setting up small business networks. I bought my house in Maplewood Heights about 2 years ago, a nice little subdivision where everyone minds their own business. Or so I thought. The house came with a 2-car garage, but since I only have 1 vehicle, I use the extra space for storage and my workshop. Life was peaceful until last Monday morning when I heard this strange rumbling sound coming from my garage. I walked out there, expecting to find maybe a raccoon or something, but instead, I found a silver Honda Civic parked right in my second bay, like it owned the place. Not halfway in, not blocking anything important, just sitting there like it belonged. The car was clean, relatively new, and had one of those stick figure family decals on the back window. You know the type. I stood there for a solid minute just staring at it, wondering if maybe I was still dreaming, but nope, there was definitely a strange car in my garage, and I had absolutely no idea how it got there. The logical first step was to figure out who owned this vehicle, so I walked around to the front of my house and looked up and down the street. Most of my neighbors were already at work, but I noticed the house directly across from mine had an older woman watering her garden. I'd seen her before, but never really talked to her. She lived with her daughter, who I'd heard was some kind of HOA bigwig. That daughter turned out to be Deborah Langston, and boy was I about to get an education in entitlement. I knocked on their front door, and after a few minutes, this woman in her late 30s answered. She was wearing old yoga pants that had seen better days, a wrinkled t-shirt, and her hair looked like she'd just rolled out of bed. But what struck me most was her expression. This look like I was bothering her by existing on her planet. Before I could even speak, she crossed her arms and gave me this up and down look that screamed judgment. "Hi," I said, trying to be polite. "I'm Connor from across the street. I think your car might be in my garage by mistake." She didn't even blink. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her like she was preparing for battle. "Oh, honey," she said, in this condescending tone that made my skin crawl. "I'm HOA president. I know exactly what I can do and where I can park." The way she said it, you'd think she was announcing she was the Queen of England. I tried to keep my voice level. "But it's my garage. I mean, it's on my property." She laughed, actually laughed, like I'd just told her the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Show me the paperwork that says I can't use unused community space," she said, pulling an old garage door remote out of her pocket and waving it around like a trophy. "Until then, I'm parking there. End of discussion." I watched her wave that remote and felt something click in my brain. That wasn't my remote. I had both of mine sitting on my kitchen counter. This woman was using an old remote, probably left behind by the previous homeowner, to access my garage without permission. She wasn't just entitled, she was actually committing what amounted to trespassing with stolen property. Just then, a man in his mid-40s walked over from the house next door. He had kind eyes, but looked tired, like someone who'd been dealing with problems for way too long. "Morning, Connor," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Walter Griggs, retired veterinarian. Sorry about this mess." He glanced at Deborah, who immediately bristled. "Walter, this doesn't concern you," she snapped, but Walter just smiled sadly and looked back at me. "Last year, she made me tear down my bird fountain because it wasn't community standard. Took me 20 years to get that fountain perfect, and she had it gone in a week." Deborah's face turned red. "That fountain was an eyesore, Walter, and you know it. Some people just don't understand community standards." She turned back to me with renewed confidence. "Look, Connor, I'll keep parking there until you learn to share community resources properly. Maybe this will teach you some social responsibility." With that, she turned around and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind her. Walter and I stood there in stunned silence for a moment. "She's been like this since her divorce 6 months ago," Walter whispered. "Lost her big house in the settlement, had to move back in with her mother. She's been taking it out on the whole neighborhood ever since." I thanked Walter for the information and walked back to my house, my mind already racing. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or neighborly dispute. Deborah Langston had deliberately chosen to target me, using her HOA position as a weapon to bully someone she perceived as an easy victim. She had no legal right to park in my garage, she knew it, and she was counting on me being too passive to fight back. Right then, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Time to give Deborah exactly what she wanted. The next morning, I woke up to find not only was Deborah's Honda still in my garage, but she'd also left a McDonald's cup and some wadded-up napkins on my workbench. The audacity was almost impressive. She wasn't just parking in my space, she was treating it like her personal storage unit and trash can. But that wasn't even the worst part. When I checked my email, I found a message that had been sent to every single resident in Maplewood Heights HOA. The subject line read, "Urgent, neighbor refuses to share parking, community safety concern." The email was a masterpiece of manipulation and lies. Deborah claimed that I was antisocial and potentially dangerous, that I was hoarding community resources, and that my aggressive behavior toward HOA leadership was creating an unsafe environment for families. She painted herself as a concerned leader trying to protect the neighborhood from a difficult resident who couldn't understand basic community cooperation. The email was full of official-sounding language and fake legal references, clearly designed to make other neighbors think she knew what she was talking about. I printed out every single page of that ridiculous email and taped them to my garage door like an art installation. "Community Education Exhibit," I wrote at the top in big black marker. "Local HOA president demonstrates modern gaslighting techniques." If Deborah wanted to play the public opinion game, I was happy to let everyone see exactly what she was working with. But I wasn't going to stop there. I had a much better plan brewing. While Deborah was busy spreading her poison through the neighborhood grapevine, I was online researching smart garage door systems. See, my computer repair background meant I knew a thing or two about electronic security systems, and I'd been thinking about upgrading my old garage door opener anyway. I found exactly what I needed. A high-end smart lock system that could be controlled remotely through a phone app and programmed with custom timer functions. Perfect for someone who might want to, say, give a trespasser exactly enough rope to hang themselves with. I ordered the system with next-day delivery and spent the evening reading installation manuals and programming guides. This wasn't just about getting Deborah's car out of my garage anymore. This was about teaching a lesson to someone who thought she could use her position to bully innocent people. Walter came over while I was unloading the boxes from my car, and when I explained what I was planning, his whole face lit up like Christmas morning. "You're actually going to lock her car in there?" he asked, trying not to laugh too loudly. "Connor, that's brilliant. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for months, and everyone's too scared to stand up to her because she threatens to fine people for every little thing." He told me about Martha Dean, Deborah's best friend who lived 3 houses down. Martha was a real estate agent who spent her days spreading gossip and backing up whatever story Deborah was selling. Together, they'd created this atmosphere of fear, where neighbors were afraid to even trim their hedges without checking the HOA handbook first. Installation took me most of the next day, but by evening I had a state-of-the-art smart lock system that could be controlled from anywhere in the world. The beauty of it was that from the outside it looked exactly like the old system. Deborah would never know anything had changed until it was too late. I programmed it with a special timer function. After activation, it would run normally for exactly 7 days, then lock down completely until I manually overrode it. The system was now armed and ready, just waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. Deborah returned from work around 6 that evening and went straight to her garage space like she owned the place. She'd started bringing more personal items, an old folding chair, some storage boxes, even a small cooler. She was actively moving in, turning my garage into her personal extension. I watched from my kitchen window as she arranged her stuff and tested the garage door, completely oblivious to the fact that she was now operating a completely different system. Around 7, she brought 3 of her friends over for what she called a garage tour. I could hear them laughing and talking as Deborah showed off how she'd improved my workspace organization. "This is so much better," one of them said. "Connor should actually thank you for fixing his mess." Another friend seemed uncomfortable and asked, "But Deborah, isn't this technically his garage?" Deborah's response made my blood boil. "Community property is community property, dear. Some people just need to learn how to share." That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and my laptop, watching the security camera feed I'd installed alongside the new lock system. Deborah had no idea she was being recorded, as she spent another hour rearranging my tools and setting up what looked like a permanent workspace. She was so confident, so absolutely certain that she'd won this battle before it even started. The lock was set, the trap was armed, and all I needed now was the perfect timing to spring it. The trap was set, now I just needed the perfect moment to spring it. With my fancy new garage lock system installed and ready, it was time for phase 2 of what I was starting to think of as Operation Karma. I spent the next morning researching vacation destinations, and Hawaii kept calling my name. 10 days of beaches, sunshine, and complete relaxation while watching Deborah's world slowly collapse through my security camera app. It was almost too perfect to be real. I booked a luxury resort package on Maui, oceanfront suites, spa treatments, snorkeling excursions, the works. The total cost was more than I'd normally spend on a vacation, but considering the entertainment value I was about to get, it seemed like a bargain. I programmed my new lock system to activate its timer on day 7 of my trip, giving Deborah just enough time to get completely comfortable and settled into her new routine before the trap snapped shut. The psychological warfare aspect of this plan was just as important as the technical side. I needed Deborah to believe she'd completely broken my spirit, that I was surrendering my garage to her superior will and authority. So I crafted the most pathetic, defeated email I could manage and sent it to her directly. Deborah, I wrote, "You've made your point crystal clear. I obviously don't understand community standards the way you do. I'm going away for 10 days to think about my behavior and attitude. Please feel free to use the garage space while I'm gone to show me how community resources should really be managed. Maybe when I come back, I'll be a better neighbor." The response was immediate and exactly what I'd hoped for. Deborah forwarded my email to half the neighborhood with her own commentary. "Finally, some people can learn when they're shown proper leadership. Connor is beginning to understand how community cooperation actually works." She even called Martha Dean and had her come over to read the email out loud like it was some kind of victory speech. I watched through my window as they stood on Deborah's front porch, laughing and high-fiving like they'd just won the lottery. But the real performance came the next day, when I had to officially hand over garage access to Deborah. I walked across the street with my shoulders slumped and my best defeated expression, carrying an envelope that I claimed contained spare garage remotes and access information. Of course, the remotes were just old ones that wouldn't work with my new system, but Deborah didn't need to know that. She was too busy enjoying her moment of triumph to ask too many questions. "I really hope you'll show me how to be a better community member," I said, handing her the envelope with what I hoped looked like genuine remorse. I never realized how selfish I was being with that garage space. Deborah practically glowed with satisfaction. "Oh, Connor, don't worry. Some people just need better guidance to understand their role in the community. I'll make sure this garage is put to much better use while you're away thinking about your mistake." That evening, Deborah threw what she called a community improvement celebration in my garage. She invited 15 neighbors, set up folding chairs, and served cheap wine and grocery store cookies. I watched the whole thing through my security cameras, listening as she gave speeches about proper resource allocation and effective neighborhood leadership. One guest asked, "Deborah, what if Connor changes his mind when he gets back?" Her response was perfect. "What's he going to do? I'm HOA president and I have documentation of his agreement to community oversight." The party was both hilarious and infuriating to watch. Deborah had completely rearranged my workshop, moved my tools around, and set up what looked like a permanent office space complete with a desk, filing cabinet, and motivational posters about community excellence. She was treating my garage like her own personal headquarters, already planning what appeared to be regular meetings and social events in the space. Martha Dean was there with her phone, taking pictures for what she kept calling the neighborhood improvement documentation. They were creating evidence of their takeover, completely confident that they'd successfully conquered what they saw as problem property. Walter showed up briefly, but I could see him looking uncomfortable as Deborah explained her plans to restructure community resource allocation throughout the entire subdivision. The morning of my departure, I loaded my suitcase into my car with deliberately exaggerated sadness, making sure Deborah could see me through her front window. I even threw in a few dramatic sighs and shoulder slumps for good effect. As I backed out of my driveway, Deborah waved from her porch with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. She had no idea she was waving goodbye to the last 7 days of happiness she'd experienced for quite a while. My flight to Maui was smooth and uneventful, and as the plane lifted off, I opened my phone to check the security camera app one more time. There was Deborah, already in my garage at 8 in the morning, rearranging furniture and setting up what looked like a permanent workspace. She was so busy enjoying her victory that she never noticed the small red light on my new garage door system, quietly counting down the days until her world would change forever. Day 7 morning in paradise. Time for my lock to introduce itself to Deborah. The first 6 days of my Hawaiian vacation were absolutely perfect. I spent my mornings on the beach, afternoons exploring the island, and evenings enjoying resort amenities that I'd only dreamed about before. But the real entertainment came from checking my security camera app throughout the day. Deborah had completely taken over my garage, treating it like her personal office and social club. She'd moved in a coffee maker, set up regular meeting times with other neighbors, and was even conducting what appeared to be official HOA business from my workbench. Every morning around 7, she'd arrive with her coffee and laptop, settling in like she was punching a time clock at her new job. She'd rearranged everything to her liking, hung up her own decorations, and had even brought in a small refrigerator for drinks and snacks. Martha Dean was there almost every day, and together they'd turned my garage into command central for their neighborhood control operations. I watched them making lists of houses to inspect, planning new rules to implement, and basically plotting how to make everyone else's life more complicated. The security cameras captured some truly amazing moments. On day 3, Deborah brought a folding table and chairs and hosted what she called a community standards workshop for 6 other neighbors. She stood at my workbench like it was a lectern, giving presentations about proper lawn maintenance and acceptable mailbox designs. The poor neighbors looked uncomfortable, but nobody was brave enough to speak up against the self-appointed neighborhood dictator. By day 5, Deborah was so comfortable that she'd started leaving personal items in the garage overnight. Family photos on the workbench, her exercise equipment in the corner, even some of her clothes hanging on hooks where I used to keep my tools. She wasn't just using my garage, she was moving into it like a second home. I watched her giving Martha a tour on day 6, pointing out all the improvements she'd made and discussing plans to expand her operation into my storage area. But day 7 was going to be special. I woke up in my oceanfront suite, ordered room service breakfast, and settled onto my balcony with my phone to watch the show. The timer on my garage lock system was set to activate at exactly 6 a.m. Hawaii time, which would be 9 a.m. back in Maplewood Heights. Perfect timing for Deborah's morning routine, when she'd be arriving with her coffee and laptop, expecting another day of ruling her new kingdom. At 9 a.m. sharp, I watched through the security camera as Deborah walked up to the garage door with her usual confidence. She had her arms full of supplies for another day of neighborhood management, file folders, a new motivational poster, and what looked like a small plant for her desk. She pressed the garage door button with the casual attitude of someone who'd done it dozens of times before, already mentally planning her morning tasks. The door didn't move, not even a little bit. Deborah stood there for a moment looking confused, then pressed the button again. Nothing. She tried the remote control, pressing it multiple times with increasing frustration. Still nothing. I could see her mouth moving as she talked to herself, probably trying to figure out what was wrong with her garage door. She set down her supplies and tried the manual override, pulling on the emergency release cord and attempting to lift the door by hand. The lock system I'd installed was top of the line, designed for maximum security. When it engaged, that door wasn't going anywhere without my personal authorization code. Deborah could pull, push, and pry all she wanted, but she might as well have been trying to move a mountain. After 10 minutes of increasingly frantic attempts, she pulled out her phone and started making calls. The first call was obviously to Martha Dean, because within 15 minutes Martha's car screeched into my driveway. I watched the two of them, pointing at the garage door, gesturing wildly and clearly trying to figure out what had gone wrong with their perfect setup. Martha tried her own set of keys and remotes, but of course, nothing worked. They spent another 20 minutes checking windows, looking for alternative entrances, and generally acting like the world was ending. Call number 2 was apparently to a locksmith because around 11 a.m., a van marked Emergency Lock Service pulled up to my house. I watched a patient locksmith explain to 2 increasingly agitated women that he couldn't just break into someone else's garage without proper authorization. "Ma'am, I need written permission from the homeowner," he kept saying, while Deborah waved her hands and insisted she had every right to access the space. The locksmith left after about 30 minutes, probably tired of dealing with what was clearly a crazy situation, but Deborah wasn't giving up. Call number 3 brought a second locksmith who gave them exactly the same explanation and drove away shaking his head. By afternoon, she was on her third locksmith of the day, this one charging premium rates for emergency service calls. I spent the rest of day 7 lounging by the pool, occasionally checking my phone to see Deborah and Martha taking turns pounding on the garage door, like that would somehow make it open. The security cameras captured every moment of their growing desperation, from confused frustration to angry determination to what looked like the beginning of genuine panic. Deborah's perfect world was starting to crack, and she had no idea how to fix it. That evening, I treated myself to a sunset dinner cruise, watching the Hawaiian sun disappear into the Pacific while 3,000 miles away, Deborah was probably lying awake wondering what had gone wrong with her foolproof plan to take over my garage. Tomorrow would bring day 8, and I had a feeling things were about to get much more interesting. Tomorrow I fly home to face the music. Wonder what Deborah learned during her week of thinking. Day 10 of my vacation dawned bright and beautiful, but I was actually excited to head home. The last 3 days had provided endless entertainment through my security camera app, watching Deborah's increasing desperation as locksmith after locksmith told her the same thing. They couldn't break into someone else's property without the owner's permission. She'd tried everything from calling the police to contacting city officials, but everyone kept giving her the same basic lesson in property rights that she apparently never learned in HOA president school. My flight landed at 4 in the afternoon, and I deliberately took my time getting home. I stopped for groceries, grabbed dinner at a drive-thru, and even detoured through a car wash, all while watching my phone screen show Deborah pacing around my driveway like a caged animal. By the time I finally pulled into my neighborhood, it was nearly 7 p.m., and quite a crowd had gathered. Word had spread about the garage situation, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had come out to watch the homecoming show. Deborah was standing in my driveway, surrounded by the remnants of her failed locksmith army. Tools scattered on the ground, 3 different business cards crumpled in her fist, in the desperate look of someone whose perfect plan had completely fallen apart. She'd clearly been there for hours, waiting for my return like a predator stalking its prey. The moment my car appeared around the corner, she started marching toward me with Martha Dean trailing behind like a reluctant sidekick. "You kidnapped my car!" she screamed before I could even get out of my vehicle. "This is illegal! This is harassment! This is..." She seemed to run out of accusations and just stood there, breathing heavily and pointing at my garage door like it had personally offended her entire family tree. I stepped out of my car, slowly, still carrying my vacation tan and the relaxed attitude of someone who had spent 10 days in paradise while his problems solved themselves. "Hi, Deborah," I said in the calmest voice I could manage. "How was your week? Get a lot of community organizing done?" The question seemed to break something in her brain. Her face turned bright red and she started sputtering about property rights and community resources and how I'd somehow violated every law in the book by locking my own garage. Martha tried to jump in with support, but even she seemed to realize how ridiculous the situation had become. "Would you like me to open the garage so you can get your car?" I asked, pulling out my phone and opening the app that controlled my smart lock system. The simple question seemed to confuse Deborah even more. She'd apparently spent so much time being angry about the situation that she'd forgotten the obvious solution was just to ask the actual owner for access to his own property. "After you compensate me for my suffering?" she demanded, as if she'd been the victim of some elaborate crime instead of the perpetrator of ongoing trespassing. "I've lost work time, I've paid locksmith fees, I've been emotionally traumatized by your vindictive behavior." The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and I could see phones coming out to record what was clearly becoming the neighborhood entertainment event of the year. Instead of arguing, I connected my phone to the large outdoor TV screen I'd set up on my back patio for movie nights. "Before we discuss compensation," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "maybe we should review exactly what happened here. I think everyone deserves to see the full story." With a few taps on my phone, the security footage from the past 2 weeks began playing on the big screen for all our neighbors to see. The crowd went silent as they watched Deborah using her stolen garage remote to break into my garage that first day. They saw her leaving trash, moving my tools, and gradually taking over the space like she owned it. They watched the party she threw in my garage, complete with her speech about how some people just need better guidance to understand their role in the community. Most damaging of all, they heard her clearly stating that community property was community property, and that she had every right to take whatever space she wanted. "Oh my God," whispered Mrs. Peterson from 2 houses down. "She actually threw a party in your garage while you were gone." Other neighbors started murmuring among themselves, and I could see the mood shifting as people realized they'd been watching a masterclass in entitlement and manipulation. Martha Dean tried to defend her friend, but her voice got smaller and smaller as more footage played. Walter appeared next to me, grinning from ear to ear. "Connor, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, loud enough for Deborah to hear. "She's been bullying this neighborhood for months, and you've just shown everyone exactly who she really is." He turned to address the crowd. "Last year, she made me tear down a bird fountain that took me 20 years to perfect, just because she didn't like how it looked. How many of you have similar stories?" The floodgates opened. Mrs. Peterson talked about the garden gnome incident. Mr. Davis described a $200 fine for parking his car slightly crooked. A young couple shared how Deborah had rejected their fence permit because the design was too cheerful for community standards. Story after story poured out as neighbors finally felt safe to speak up about months of harassment and intimidation. Officer Dylan Kessler, who had apparently been called to the scene by someone, watched the security footage with professional interest. "Ma'am," he said to Deborah, "you used an unauthorized garage remote to access someone else's property, held personal belongings there without permission, and refused to leave when asked. That's textbook trespassing. Mr. Walsh has every right to secure his own garage however he sees fit." Deborah's last desperate move was to demand HOA intervention, insisting that her position as president gave her special authority over community resources. But Walter just laughed and pulled out an official-looking document. "Funny thing about that, Deborah. We had an emergency board meeting yesterday after Mrs. Peterson showed us Connor's security footage. The board voted unanimously to remove you from the presidency, effective immediately. Turns out, abuse of power isn't actually in our HRA." The look on Deborah's face when she realized she'd lost everything was almost worth the 2 weeks of aggravation she'd put me through. Almost. 2 days after my homecoming spectacular, I was enjoying my morning coffee in my newly reclaimed garage when Walter knocked on the door with a huge grin on his face. "Connor," he said, barely containing his excitement, "you're not going to believe this. Deborah called Channel 7 News yesterday and told them she's the victim of a high-tech harassment campaign. They're sending a crew over this morning to interview her about the dangerous cybersecurity expert who's terrorizing the neighborhood." I nearly spit out my coffee. The idea that Deborah thought she could spin this story into a victim narrative was so absurd that I couldn't help but laugh. But then I realized this could actually work in my favor. If a news crew was coming to investigate, they'd want to hear both sides of the story, and I had something Deborah didn't: actual evidence. I spent the next hour organizing my documentation. The security footage, screenshots of Deborah's harassing emails, photos of her belongings in my garage, and witness statements from neighbors about her pattern of bullying behavior. I also printed out copies of the HOA board's decision to remove her from office, complete with the official vote count and list of violations she'd committed. The Channel 7 van pulled up around 10 a.m., followed immediately by Deborah, who'd apparently spent considerable time on her appearance for this television debut. She'd done her hair, put on makeup, and was wearing what looked like her most professional outfit. Martha Dean was there too, carrying a folder that probably contained her own version of events. Reporter Jessica Martinez looked like she'd rather be covering actual news instead of a suburban neighborhood dispute, but she set up her camera and began the interview. "Mrs. Langston, you claim that your neighbor has used technology to harass and intimidate you. Can you tell us what happened?" Deborah launched into her prepared speech about community cooperation and resource sharing, painting herself as a dedicated public servant who'd been victimized by a vindictive neighbor with too much technical knowledge. "He trapped my car in his garage using some kind of high-tech security system," Deborah said, managing to sound both outraged and pitiful at the same time. "I'm just trying to help our community make better use of shared resources, and he's using intimidation tactics to silence neighborhood leadership. It's cyberbullying, plain and simple." Jessica nodded sympathetically and then asked the question that changed everything. "Mrs. Langston, this garage where your car was trapped, is that your garage?" Deborah's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well, no, it's technically his property, but as HOA president, I have oversight of community resource allocation." Jessica's eyebrows went up. "So you parked your car in someone else's garage without their permission?" The interview went downhill fast from there. Every question Jessica asked revealed another layer of Deborah's entitled behavior. When asked about the garage remote, Deborah had to admit it belonged to the previous homeowner. When asked about permission, she claimed her HOA position gave her special rights that didn't actually exist. When asked about the party she'd thrown in my garage, she tried to frame it as a community improvement meeting. Then Jessica asked to interview me. I walked over with my folder of evidence and my most reasonable demeanor. Mr. Walsh, Mrs. Langston claims you've been harassing her. How do you respond to these allegations? I smiled calmly and handed her a tablet loaded with security footage. I think the evidence speaks for itself. Would you like to see what actually happened? The camera rolled as Jessica watched clips of Deborah breaking into my garage, throwing parties, leaving trash, and generally treating my property like her personal kingdom. You could see her expression change as she realized she'd been fed a completely fabricated story. Mrs. Langston, she called over, can you explain why you're on camera throwing a party in Mr. Walsh's garage while he was out of town? Martha Dean tried to jump in with damage control, but it was too late. Other neighbors had gathered around, and when Jessica started asking them about their experiences with Deborah's leadership, the floodgates opened again. Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Davis, and half a dozen other residents shared their stories of harassment, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics. The coup de grace came when Walter produced the official HOA board resolution removing Deborah from office. We had an emergency meeting after seeing Mr. Walsh's security footage, he explained to the camera. The board voted unanimously that Mrs. Langston had abused her position and violated multiple HOA policies. She's no longer authorized to speak for our community. Jessica turned back to Deborah for a response, but Deborah had apparently realized how badly this was going. Her face was bright red, and she was backing toward her car like she wanted to escape. "This is all lies," she shouted. "He's manipulated everyone against me. I'll sue this entire neighborhood." With that, she got in her car and drove off, leaving Martha standing alone with a camera pointed at her face. The story aired that evening with the headline, HOA President Abuses Power, Gets Locked Out. The segment showed all the best clips: Deborah's party in my garage, her interview meltdown, and the neighbors celebrating her removal from office. The story went viral online, shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from supportive to absolutely savage. But the real consequences were just beginning. Deborah's insurance company saw the news coverage and launched an investigation into her professional conduct. Her supervisors weren't thrilled about their employee being the star of a viral video about abuse of power and property violations. Within a week, she was placed on indefinite suspension, pending a review of her client interactions and professional behavior. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was experiencing something it hadn't felt in months: peace. Walter had been elected as interim HOA president, and his first official act was to eliminate all of Deborah's punitive fines and harassment policies. The community garden was restored, Mrs. Peterson got her gnomes back, and people actually started talking to each other again instead of hiding from the HOA enforcement police. Deborah still had one final card to play, but sometimes your last card just proves why you're losing the game. 2 weeks after the news crew debacle, I decided it was time for a proper celebration. I sent out invitations to every household in Maplewood Heights for a garage reclamation barbecue, complete with the tagline, "Come celebrate community resources being used for actual community purposes." I set up grilling stations, borrowed tables and chairs from neighbors, and hung a banner across my garage that read, "Garage officially unstolen." The turnout was incredible. 43 neighbors showed up, including several families I'd never met before. It turned out that Deborah's reign of terror had made a lot of people afraid to participate in community events, but with her gone, everyone was ready to be social again. Mrs. Peterson brought her famous potato salad, Mr. Davis set up a music playlist, and the young couple with the rejected fence brought homemade cupcakes, decorated like tiny garages. Walter, in his new role as HOA president, used the gathering to announce some major policy changes. First, he said, addressing the crowd from my workbench that had once served as Deborah's command center, "We're eliminating all punitive fines for minor violations. No more $200 penalties for parking slightly crooked or having the wrong color mailbox." The crowd actually cheered. Second, he continued, "We're implementing a neighbor mediation system. If there are disputes, we'll work them out through discussion and compromise, not intimidation and harassment. And third, we're instituting term limits for all HOA positions. No more neighborhood dictatorships." More cheers, and I could see people actually smiling and relaxing for the first time in months. Martha Dean surprised everyone by showing up with a plate of brownies and a formal apology. "I want everyone to know that I was wrong to support Deborah's behavior," she announced to the group. "I got caught up in the gossip and drama, and I helped spread lies about Connor and other neighbors. I'm starting a new initiative called Neighbor Kindness, where we focus on helping each other instead of finding things to complain about." The party was going perfectly when we spotted a familiar U-Haul truck pulling up to Deborah's mother's house across the street. Through the windows, we could see Deborah loading boxes and furniture, apparently moving out for good. The entire BBQ crowd went quiet for a moment, watching the final chapter of our neighborhood drama unfold. Nobody went over to help, nobody said goodbye, and nobody seemed particularly sad to see her go. "Where do you think she's moving?" asked Mrs. Peterson, more out of curiosity than concern. Walter shrugged. "Her mother mentioned something about Deborah finding a small apartment 3 states away. Apparently her insurance job didn't work out after the news coverage, and she needs to start fresh somewhere that doesn't know her story." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I read it out loud to the group. "Thank you for stopping her. I'm Deborah's ex-husband, and she did this exact same thing throughout our marriage. She targeted our neighbors, made enemies everywhere we lived, and refused to see that she was the problem. I tried to get her help, but she wouldn't listen. Maybe this will finally be the wake-up call she needs." The message put everything into perspective. This wasn't just about a garage or an HOA dispute. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been destroying relationships and communities for years. By standing up to Deborah's bullying, I hadn't just solved my own problem, I'd potentially saved dozens of future victims from the same harassment. Around sunset, as the party was winding down, I found myself standing in my garage looking around at the transformation. Where Deborah had set up her control center, there were now folding tables covered with leftover food and neighbors chatting quietly. Where she'd hung her motivational posters about community excellence, Walter had put up a simple sign that read, "Neighbors helping neighbors." The young couple approached me as they were getting ready to leave. "Connor," the husband said, "we just wanted to thank you for what you did. We were actually thinking about moving because Deborah made our lives so miserable. Now we're excited to stay and be part of a real community." His wife nodded and added, "We've learned something important. You don't have to be anyone's victim, even if they have an official title." As the last neighbors headed home, Walter helped me clean up the garage. "You know," he said, folding chairs and stacking plates, "I've been thinking about converting half of this space into a community workshop. Nothing fancy, just a place where neighbors can borrow tools, work on projects together, maybe teach each other new skills." I loved the idea immediately. My garage, which had been the source of so much conflict, could become a symbol of genuine community cooperation. Over the next few weeks, that's exactly what happened. We set up a tool-sharing program, started hosting monthly fix-it workshops, and even began teaching neighborhood kids basic repair skills. The space that Deborah had tried to steal for her own power trip became something much better, a real community resource that brought people together instead of driving them apart. 6 months later, I received an official letter from the Maplewood Heights HOA. Walter had nominated me for the annual Community Service Award, citing my role in restoring neighborhood harmony and demonstrating that individual rights and community cooperation can coexist peacefully. The award came with a small plaque that now hangs in my garage workshop, right where Deborah used to keep her motivational posters about community excellence. Sometimes I think about that 10-day vacation and how perfectly everything worked out. Deborah thought she was punishing me by stealing my garage, but she actually gave me the perfect opportunity to teach her about consequences. Smart planning really does beat loud arguing every time, and communities really do work better when everyone understands the rules. And speaking of rules, here's the most important one I learned from this whole experience. You don't have to be anyone's victim, no matter how official their title sounds or how entitled their behavior seems. Sometimes bullies just need to meet someone who's willing to be smarter instead of louder. Best vacation I ever took, and I didn't even have to leave the country to get justice. Anyone else have HOA horror stories? I'd love to hear how you handled your neighborhood drama in the comments below. Remember, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning, it's about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through the same thing.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.